My name is Helen Moss. I'm the Senior Vice President for International Theatrical Distribution for Paramount Pictures. It's my pleasure to be with you today. I propose to talk a little bit about the wonderful success that we're all enjoying with the current release of Bob Marley, One Love, movie that it's been an absolute dream to work on. I then want to talk a little bit about how the greenlight process works in a major studio. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we release movies internationally, and I'll give you a bit of an update as to where the business is now, because as you can appreciate, post-pandemic, the industry is in a bit of a state of flux, and also with the impact of the strike last year still being felt. So with that, I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint presentation, and just going to check you can all see the screen. Hold on one second. Here we go. I assume you can all see that slide. Okay, so just talking, and I should have said actually it was at the start of my presentation, if you have questions, I would welcome them at the end. So please don't hold back. Whatever you want to ask, I'll try and address it. But let's just take a moment to enjoy and celebrate the success of Bob Marley. And I just realized I haven't written One Love at the top of the slide, but there you go, Bob Marley, One Love. We have, we're still in release internationally and domestically. As I said, I cover the international business, so I'm going to give you an update on the international side of the business. We had an incredible opening 3 weekends ago. Internationally, we grossed 29 million in opening weekend. To put that into some perspective, that was an opening that was 14% bigger internationally than Elvis and 12% bigger than Rocketman for the same group of markets. So that was a really stellar result. One of the benefits of our opening was that it opened on Valentine's Day, and it was a perfect movie for that corridor, and we had some record-breaking numbers on that opening Wednesday. But the film opened in 47 markets that weekend, which was approximately 90% of the footprint of the markets that we will open this movie in. And overall, it was the second biggest music biopic opening, just behind only behind Bohemian Rhapsody. So we, as a studio and with the partners and the director and the producers of the movie, are very, very proud of this result. But we've got a long way to go. The QM as of this morning internationally was 58 million, and we've still got lots of markets to open. Next weekend, we've got Asia, including bigger markets such as Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, and Malaysia, and several others. And then we have in May, mid-May, we will release in Japan. So still a lot of box office to be banked for this movie, and there's a lot of love for it. One of the beauties of a film like this is that audiences, whilst they did turn out in their droves on opening weekend, we are continuing to see this film hold very, very well. And that is really important, particularly with a weekend like this weekend, where you have a massive blockbuster Dune 2 in release. But I'm thrilled to see that the early results that I was looking at this morning, and I'll review again tomorrow morning, will suggest that we will hold our own against Dune. But let's now just shift to the other items I wish to cover today. Decisions to greenlight, how we choose release dates, censorship, and the state of the industry. So the decision to greenlight a movie from a studio standpoint is, no surprise, the biggest and the most important decision a studio can make. Get it right at greenlight, you're off to the races. Get it wrong, it's a real struggle. But it's really hard to get all the information that you need at that early stage. And remember, greenlight can be a very simple process where you may not even have a script, you may not have a director, you may not have talent attached to a project. You may just have a basic synopsis to work on. Sometimes you may have a book, you may have a script, or you may have an idea that somebody wants to turn into a screenplay. So you can, and on the rare occasion, not typical for Paramount, on a rare occasion, we may buy a film that has already been made. But when you're making the decision to greenlight a movie, you have to work with the data you have. And so if you understand the size of the production value budget, for example, that will help you ascertain how big the size of the movie is going to be. So just big picture, if you were to think about a big Fast and Furious live action, huge tentpole movie, or a movie like a Mission Impossible or a James Bond movie, typically those the production values for those films are 180 to 250 million. So you can understand that you're going to need to get a lot of bums on seats, and you're going to need to gross a lot of box office in order to make that film profitable. But at the point of greenlight, my role in international is to ascertain how much box office can I bring to the party. And I will work with my domestic counterpart to see what they believe the film can deliver for the US and Canada. And overall, we build a P&L to determine the profitability of the film. We also look at other things that might help us determine the success of the movie. The most obvious one is comparable films. Is there a film that you think has the same theme or idea? So in the case of Bob Marley, something like Rocket Man would be, or Elvis would be a great and similar film that you would benchmark against. It would be hard to benchmark a film that will be perhaps 10 or 20 years old in release, because the footprint of cinema going has changed. So you have to look at relatively recent films. You also will look at what does the director and talent mean for the movie? Are the talent well known? Is the director well known? If it's a Martin Scorsese or a Ridley Scott or a Steven Spielberg movie, what does that mean? Does that mean that audiences automatically will turn out because they love the films that they have made previously? Similarly, talent can be very strong with opening a movie if they're well known. No surprise, something like Tom Cruise would be a real draw for audiences. It's almost like a hallmark, a guarantee of success. We also look at audience demographics to understand who is it that we're trying to attract to this movie. If it's a family movie, for example, will you be able to attract 4 quadrants? Will you be able to get grandmothers and grandfathers to come with the little children to see the movie? Is there something for them? Or is it a very young movie? If it's a young movie, then potentially you may not be able to attract children, say, older than 10 or 12 years old. And so therefore you're limiting the audience that you potentially will attract. But it's important to know that audience. Is it a teenage audience, as we recently saw with the release of Mean Girls, the musical, where we had a heavy audience of young teenage girls, but also were able to extend the audience to the mothers that enjoyed Mean Girls the first time around. Cultural interest matters, and locations. And no surprise, Bob Marley is a perfect example. For people to be able to see Jamaica and to be excited by what that means, and all the other locations in the movie, is a very important part of a movie. And if you think about other bigger action movies, like a James Bond movie where they may be in front of the Eiffel Tower, or a Tom Cruise Mission Impossible movie where he's climbing the Burj Khalifa, those things matter to movie making and make it important for those cities. And it can also be, from a tax and investment standpoint, lucrative as well. And then finally, and I'm going to come on to this more later on, but it's important to understand the censorship rating for the movie, because that will limit the audience potentially. So I'm now going to move on to what happens when we greenlight a movie. We put all of this information together, and we look at the P&L and we make an assessment. Now, sometimes the P&L isn't the sole story for the decision whether to greenlight a movie. It may be borderline. It may be that there's a slight risk to the movie. You still may wish to make the movie and make that decision to move forward because perhaps you're trying to continue to build a relationship with a director or a talent who has a specific desire or passion to make the movie. So there's a reason that you may wish to proceed. Other times you may think you have a gut instinct that the film is a good one. And a great example here is the movie Smile, which Paramount released in 2022. This was a film that came up for Greenlight the year before. And I remember the studio felt it was quite a high-risk project. And so from a theatrical standpoint, decided not to proceed. But the beauty of having a streaming part of the business, Paramount Plus, they were willing to take the risk. The budget was significantly less for them, and so they made the movie. When the movie was finished, Brian Robbins, our chairman, looked at the movie and saw that it was something very special and something quite different than what he had anticipated. And then it was brought back to the studio and we undertook a theatrical release with huge success. And as a result, we have now built a franchise and we have Smile 2 releasing in October this year. So sometimes the decision to make the movie isn't just financial, but obviously a studio has to consider that when making that overall decision. Once a green light a decision has been made and a movie is in production, my team's role during that time, and that time can be anything from 12 months, 2 years, maybe even 3 years, depending on the size of the movie. But my team's role is to help determine when best to release the film into theatres. And that's quite complex. A studio overall needs to consider the overall slate for a year. They're not going to put all of their films out in the first quarter, for example. They also want to have a balanced slate so that they can manage the cash flow and overall for the company. But when we look at films and release dates, there are often some very obvious dates. A family movie releasing at Christmas. A live action movie releasing in the early summer corridor. A rom-com releasing over Valentine's weekend. An animation movie releasing over the Easter corridor. There are many dates that matter, and they are often the dates that I mentioned, which the studio will kind of grab early on for the bigger releases. But typically what we will do when we are dating a movie, we'll consider first of all the US release date. The size of that market warrants us to look at it. It doesn't always mean that we will release in the US first, but it is often the case. We have to take into consideration world events, and that may be the World Cup, the Olympics, or anything significant that's happening across the markets. And I release typically in anything between 70 and 90 markets. So there's a lot of things to consider. If you have a movie that potentially has some likelihood of winning or getting nominated for some Golden Globes or Oscars or BAFTAs, you may want to hold your movie to release during award season so that you can ensure that it's getting maximum viewing and the best opportunity to win those awards. One of the other things that we will consider is the theatrical window that will apply to the release. Now, pre-pandemic, typically, films would have a 90-day window from when they released in theatres to the next stage of their journey through home entertainment and premium view on demand. Since the pandemic, that theatrical window has crashed quite considerably and with good reason. And typically the window is now around 40 to 50 days internationally, a little less in the US. So we have to be cognizant of what that window is going to be in the US so that if we're going to release the film internationally, that we're not releasing it and it's already available on the streaming platform. It's really important that I look at competition when I'm releasing a movie. And that's not just Hollywood titles, it's also local titles. There are many markets that have a burgeoning, really successful and very powerful local film market. Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Germany, Spain, France, to name a few. And those local titles can be absolutely massive. And you have to make sure that you're not dating a movie against a film that means it's going to take away potential eyeballs and admissions from your own film. Seasonality and holidays is a pretty obvious thing to consider when dating a movie. It's quite difficult for me on occasions because the holidays that the US enjoys are not necessarily aligned with the holidays that I have to consider internationally. So, for example, Memorial Day or July 4th or Thanksgiving holidays don't exist in many countries, and therefore they may be the perfect optimal date for the domestic business to release a movie, not so much for me. And then finally, I have to consider the overall risk for a movie. So if I feel there are countries that may not perform to the level that I think they might, I might delay their release and release other markets up front sooner so that I can assess their performance and then make a decision whether I wish to continue with those later markets or pull back on them. When I say pull back, I may reduce the marketing that we're going to spend to promote the film, or I may forego a theatrical cinematic release altogether. So once a film is moving forward in production, I'm looking at several elements to consider how I'm going to get it into market. I'm going to be looking at what formats I'm going to release the movie in, whether it's in 2D and 3D, whether it's in IMAX, whether it's in 4DX or Luma, or all the many different formats that theatres have available today. But I want to maximize the viewing opportunity for patrons. And certainly post-pandemic, it's been quite tricky to get patrons to get off their seats, leave home, and not watch movies on their television screens and actually go to a theatre. And so it's imperative to ensure that the theatres are offering the most interesting and fun experience to get people out of home. And one of the most easiest ways to do that is by offering premium large screens, fabulous reclining seating, in-theatre eating, and just a very slick, nice experience that you can't replicate at home with fabulous sound and great viewing. So once I've determined the formats as to how we're going to release the film, it's usually getting close to release. And I may hopefully start to get to see some cuts, early cuts of the movie. That's when I start to have to consider censorship. And hopefully the censorship that I was led to believe when I greenlit the movie or read the script, hopefully will prevail. But the problem that I have to deal with is that censorship ratings vary across many, many markets. What works in one country isn't necessarily acceptable in another. And you can imagine why. It's religious and political variations, social and cultural dynamics that mean a different what is acceptable in one country is not okay and is off limits to an audience in another country. Censorship processes are there to protect, and we don't have any ability to influence those censorship, but we can influence our movie. We can make edits and cuts, and it is very rare for us not to make any edits and cuts to a movie. And a lot of people are surprised by that. And some of those edits and cuts are pretty normal. It may be to remove swearing or to remove something that's offensive in a country. We can usually edit that, or we can use dubbing. But there are other elements that we have to consider, and you'll see at the bottom of this slide some images of the types of things that we have to consider across markets. Now, a film, just because it gets a high rating, isn't necessarily a bad thing. Films like, for example, John Wick are going to attract an 18 rating, and you almost want them to. That's the nature of the film. But there are other films that we don't necessarily expect, or we don't have we have to consider the cultural expectations of the country, particularly with regard to things like sex and nudity and weaponry. So, for example, weapons, what may be, a gun may be acceptable in one country, just having it on somebody holding a gun, but if it's pointed to somebody's head, as if they're going to shoot somebody, that may determine a higher rating. Knife weapons in movies, for example, are acceptable typically in the US, but have a higher rating in the UK. Drugs and alcohol is very tricky. Sometimes just having drug paraphernalia in view on the movie is not acceptable, whereas in other movies where you actually see use of drugs, shooting up or injecting or snorting cocaine, those things can attract different ratings in different markets. And then finally, things like religion and geopolitical tensions are tricky, and as you would appreciate, the line is always moving. The world is constantly changing, and what is acceptable now may not be acceptable in 2 years' time when a film is made. So we have to be cognizant and respectful of markets. And on occasions, we may not be able to release a film. And I will give you an example, something like Saudi Arabia, which has loosened its attitude to some of its previous concerns with regard to censorship. We've seen them perhaps being more accepting to some of the Western behaviors. But many markets, the censorship is there, as I say, to protect. And we as a studio have to honor that and deliver the most, the best movie we can with as few edits as possible. So moving on now to the state of the industry. So this chart shows the box office in 2019 on the left-hand side, where you'll see the global box office was 42.5 billion in 2019. That was a record-breaking year for the industry. And then, no surprise, 2020 and the pandemic kicked in, and the business really shut down in early March and didn't really prevail for a very long time. Indeed, there was some recovery in 21 in certain markets, and other markets suffered, as we all know. 2022 saw a nice increase, and then in 2023 we have seen a very nice increase from 26 billion in 22 to 33.9 million in 2023, a 30% increase. Now, that's still 20% below that record-breaking year in 2019. But I think you can agree, to see these massive increases year on year is testament to show that this industry is strong and robust. The other thing to note is that last year, for half of the year, unfortunately, Hollywood suffered 2 strikes, writers and the actors strike. So essentially, you can consider half of the year there was a production hiatus, and there was a lot of films that shifted out of the last quarter, either because they weren't finished or because talent weren't available to promote and work the movie. So just imagine for a moment that had we had a finer quarter 4 and there wasn't the strikes, I think that number would have been even higher, and we would have perhaps been in the teens below 2019. That said, in 2024, I think it's going to be a tricky year. I think we'll probably be flat or maybe a little bit below 2023, purely because of the lack of titles as a result of the strike. But believe me, 2025 and beyond, the slate is looking very, very robust. And whilst it may delay us getting back to those lofty numbers of 2019, I am certain that we're going to see that probably by 2026 or 2027. And then finally, if that wasn't enough to give you some enthusiasm for where the industry stands right now, I thought I would share this slide with you, which is surprising to many people. A lot of people think this industry is in the doldrums post-pandemic, but let me tell you otherwise. The 5 films that you see on this slide are all in the top 15 highest grossing movies ever to have released. And all 5 of these released post-pandemic. That's pretty crazy when you actually look at that result. You've got Spider-Man there, Avatar from 2021, Top Gun 2022, and then the wonderful Barbie and Mario Brothers in 2023. So I think therein is proof that if we give audiences a reason to come to the movies, they will come. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Helen, thank you so much. That was succinct and really to the point. I'm going to open up the questions to the floor and see what we have going on. So yes, industry is allowed. Any questions? Wow. All right, go ahead.
Hi, Helen. Thank you so much. I think we've all been, very aware of the wonderful marketing campaign that you guys have been doing worldwide for the film. Some really, creative ideas. And we're all very aware that it must have cost a lot of money. Are you able to share what the marketing costs have been for that?
Sadly, I'm not. That's not really something I'm able to do. But you're right, it's expensive, and marketing any product and marketing movies is enormously expensive. But I think that the thing that I would say, it's not necessarily the focus for me about the cost. It's about the teams finding different and new ideas. And you can spend an awful lot of money buying a Super Bowl spot to get eyeballs. You can spend an awful lot of money buying TV spots. And for a lot of movies, we would do that. But oftentimes, I think it's the success that you can get from having a campaign that's something a little bit different. And I'm going to go back to the movie Smile that we released in 2022. And I'm sure that many of you will recall the campaign where we had actors sitting in sports stadiums with the smile. Do you remember that? You know, that kind of crazy smile. That was incredibly cheap, but that went viral and it was amazingly successful. Some of the wonderful campaigns I've seen on the Bob Marley campaign have been where, and I don't know if you have seen it, I can maybe share an image with you separately or after this, but particularly in France, I think our French team have just absolutely nailed this campaign. They really have. They had the, I can see somebody you've seen the big wheel by the Eiffel Tower. What a wonderful image, and I can see you smiling, the lady there with the lovely chain on and the pink top. If you haven't seen it, do take a look. It was a vinyl record on a wheel next to the Eiffel Tower, and it's all AI. So let's think about, when we talk about marketing budgets, it's now finding those new and intriguing ideas. And there's another one that our Italian team did, another AI version, where they had a huge Bob Marley guitar looking like it was being transported through the streets of Rome. And it's just enormous. Take a look at it. So it's about finding innovative campaigns that socially will travel and make a viral impact.
Oh, Helen, I want you to address, there's a question about AI. I was happy that just brought that up. Because a lot of persons didn't know it was AI. You didn't know that it was AI? Oh, wow. So Shalon, can you show the question in the chat? That says there's a question in an AI question in the chat. Helen, you want
to? Hang on, let me have a look.
Sure, I can read it for you.
Hang on, I'll be curious to know what Helen thinks of AI advance and how it will impact filmmaking and budgets. Okay, I can see it. Thank you. AI is tricky. AI is going to impact the AI revolution is going to impact every one of us in every part of life, and it's too early to say what's going to happen in the movie industry. I'm seeing it in little pockets. For example, there is talk of what it can mean in terms of dubbing and subtitling. Quality isn't there yet. Quality is far from there. We've seen some companies using it with some success, but from a movie, you know, it's a long way from being there. That doesn't mean to say ultimately it may happen, but there's a lot of things to consider, and there's a lot of rules and laws that have to be put in place to protect talent and make sure that their visual looks and their sound are not abused. And everyone would want that, not just in filmmaking, but in every walk of life. We're all going to want to make sure that there are guardrails in place. But I think there's a lot of smart things that can help with regard to AI in terms of editing and post-production that will accelerate and help get movies finished quicker. Now, I don't have a lot of details particularly, but what I do know is that that's not necessarily going to mean a loss of jobs. I think it's going to mean a huge amount of new and different jobs that we haven't necessarily seen and learned. If you think back to, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, before the world of apps, you know, nobody was an app designer, nobody aspired to be an app designer. Now it's an integral part of life. So I don't fear AI. I'm excited to see what it's going to bring to our industry, and I think it's going to be a game changer for everyone.
Any more question here? Go ahead. Justine, you wanted to ask.
Thank you, Helen. In terms of English language titles that you're distributing, outside of America, is there usually one other territory like the UK or something that is the bulk of the international? What's that kind of pie chart? What does it break down after America?
Okay, yes, the UK is the next biggest territory, but it's funny because it really depends on the movie. So if you have a musical like Bob Marley or Rocket Man, or a high-end drama, or something like a Mean Girls, the majority of the box office, you will probably see 25 to 30% of the box office coming from the UK and Australia, and then other markets that take an English-speaking version as well. So that would be South Africa, the Netherlands, Ireland, and New Zealand. But typically the UK will usually run at about 12 to 15% of the overall box office. The one time that it can be different is when you have China in release. Now, China is a completely different beast, and I'm not necessarily, don't have the time to get into that today, but if you have China in release, that can be a huge opportunity for a film. But not all films are appropriate for the Chinese market. They love a movie like Transformers, they love a movie like Mission Impossible, but many films the audience are not that excited about, and we don't tend to release all of our films there. So typically the UK will be the highest. Our top 5 markets will be UK, Australia, France, Germany, Japan, and Mexico, and then China if we have the opportunity to release a film.
Very good.
It's open now.
You didn't mention India, Helen? Nothing for India?
India is a tricky market. It's funny because we've been trying to break India for many years. India has enjoyed its biggest ever year in 2023. It's had 3 particular local Hindi movies that just did incredible business. And the local titles in India are incredibly strong and popular. But but saying that, and those 3 films typically each grossed in the market between 70 and 80 million in India itself. That is enormous. To put that into perspective, the biggest performing movie last year in India from a Hollywood standpoint was Oppenheimer, that did 19 million, which was an incredible number, but nowhere near as big as the local titles. And that's tricky. In India, films do work, but it's rare to see a film and India being in one of our top 10 territories.
Some more questions here?
Yeah,
You have a question? Who has a question?
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Right, so UK markets, USA, not so much in China, but we find that our Caribbean people have now was filtrated, is the right word, into most of those markets, because of migration, because of like 30, 40 years ago, they don't have their children and their roots are now there. The Caribbean local film market, is there a research to say, hey, I mean, we have people in UK who are Caribbean from our origin. We have people in China who are Caribbean by origin, and in the US who are Caribbean by origin. So what's the statistics to have our film go there?
I don't have statistics that I can give you for something like that, but we do look at it. We certainly would look at that and understand where those populations are. For example, I'm intrigued, and I can't tell you the name of the city. I can't remember the name of the city, but there is a huge reggae, massive super fan group in Japan. Not in Tokyo, it's in a city that I don't recall the name. And they are incredibly excited for Bob Marley. And it was funny, we never knew about it until we were talking with our local team about the marketing campaign for Bob Marley. And they explained the size of this market, the passion. And so you do find pockets, and it's important for our local teams on the ground. And I don't necessarily get hugely involved in that, but it's important for them to find those audiences. And certainly in the UK, where there's a huge population that have migrated to the UK, finding that audience and celebrating something like Bob Marley was, and you know, it's exactly what has to happen. But it is important to do that for other movies. And going back to the Indian movie market, we released a film called Forrest Gump, a remake of Forrest Gump, a couple of years ago. And there's a huge Indian population in 2 or 3 places just outside London. And it's about finding those audiences, putting on special screenings to really bring the communities out. And our local markets know those audiences, and that's their challenge, to make sure that they're aware of the movie and that they're included and able to see the film and be part of the journey.
Helen,
Go ahead, stand up, you can stand up.
about what stage do you get involved personally? What stage of development of a movie? What stage do you personally get involved, when it's finished, or? No.
So essentially, I get involved at the green light stage of the movie. So as I said at the beginning of the presentation, a film typically we may have a script, we may have a synopsis or an idea. In the case of Bob Marley, we had a script. We knew who was going to be attached to it, who was going to play Bob, who the director was. So we almost had a perfect here, what is the green light? And for something like Bob Marley, it was like, well, this is brilliant, this is great. My job was then to figure out which markets were going to be really strong, which markets that we thought were going to be strong, or which markets we didn't even know. For example, in my ignorance, I didn't realize how massive Bob was in Brazil. And that was a real, and it wasn't until we started to do research and understand that you're actually able to know that. So I get involved at that stage at green light, and then my role, as I said, is to determine how big can the film be internationally. And if it's a book or something that we can cling to, it's easier for me to do my research to understand the potential. And it's harder when you have an unknown property, an unknown IP. You may not have any talent attached to a movie. You may not have a director. That's a bit of a head scratcher to figure out what is the potential for a movie. And many movies don't necessarily achieve their green lights, let me tell you that.
All right.
Question? Yeah. I know that Paramount Plus has documentaries, but is there often a theatrical distribution for a documentary? And if so, what kind of a documentary would be the kind of a film that would get the green light to do that? Do you ever hear about this? Like, the industry. So that's the question. Do documentaries get into the cinemas? Ever?
Very, very, very rare. Very rare. I haven't worked on a documentary that's had a theatrical release. A theatrical release is tricky. Doesn't mean to say it can't happen, but that would fall into like a specialist category. And in many cases, that would be where they would put it into art houses. and they would do releases for a small amount of time in a small amount of theatres in just maybe in one country. And that can happen, but it's not necessarily, it's never going to get a wide release. A wide release, you need to be to cover the cost and make it worthwhile. You need to be having multiple shows a day in many, many theatres. And for a documentary, there is just not enough eyeballs, as it were, for people that are going to be willing to go and see it. When they feel something like that, they can see at home. They don't have what's the uniqueness of being to see it in a movie? It's not in 3D, it's not in IMAX. What is it I'm going to get that's something that's really special? So it is highly unlikely. And if it is going to happen, it's going to be something that's hand carried by a small production company in a single market, likely.
We have a question online. All right, so this is from Pierce. Can you expand on the full release life of movies, theater to DVD, to streaming platforms, to local TV releases, etc.? Do you handle all that? When is the film life over?
I don't handle it at all. My world ends with a theatrical release. And the journey, once it leaves the theatre, can differ. Every film is different, and every studio handles it differently. So I'm going to give you a vague kind of an idea as to what happens. I mentioned earlier on about the window, and the window will differ for every, typically for most films and for most studios and many countries, they differ. But if we were to take a typical film internationally, will be in theatres, will play in theatres for 60 days, 50 to 60 days, and then it will start its downstream journey. And depending on the type of film, it might have a premium offering where people can access it at home for a premium, where they're paying for that. That usually lasts for a couple of weeks before it then starts its journey again through to the streaming platforms. And it really depends on who owns the movie and where the rights reside, as to whether it will go to the streaming platform in the case of Paramount Plus, or if it was for a Disney movie, it would go to Disney Plus or Peacock with Universal, for example. So it really depends on who owns it and what the rights are for the movie as to when it will feature on the streaming platform, and then when it becomes available much later on free on the and on other TV channels. And it will then that can take many months before that actually becomes available. And then ultimately you've also got airlines where movies are available to be seen on airlines and in other sort of non-typical places. But it's not uncommon, you know, a film's trajectory from when you start greenlighting a movie, when you open a movie, typically a film will still be generating revenue, not necessarily large revenues, but generating revenues 8 to 10 years after release. And in cases of some films, you know, some films like It's a Wonderful Life or The Godfather or Home Alone, obviously they get a spike certain times of the year because people want to watch them time and time again.
And I'm going to do a wrap up to see if there are any final questions. There are two more on the screen here. Where is the biggest market for science fiction and horror? And would you say there is a most profitable genre?
Okay, those are very good questions. So first of all, where is the biggest market for science fiction and horror? I'm going to answer horror first of all. Horror has evolved over the last 10 years or so. 10, 15 years ago, horror was not a particularly profitable or big genre. And then we had movies like Get Out and It and our own Paramount success with A Quiet Place. And suddenly we found this new and young and interested audience, particularly teenage girls. Don't know why, but they absolutely loved horror. And that audience is now kind of, I would say, from young teens, depending on the censorship rating, right through to people in their 40s. There's a really strong appetite for horror, and we've seen things like the Conjuring universe and It, as I mentioned, and we've got our own A Quiet Place and Smile. There's a plethora of different types of horror, whether it's your slasher horror, your thoughtful horror, all of that genre has really, really grown exponentially. Interestingly, something like religious horror, massive, typically in Mexico and many Latin American markets. Horror is less, I would say, successful in a lot of the Asian markets. And in Europe, it's typically, I think it's more successful in, it's very successful in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. But then if I go to sci-fi, it really depends on the type of movie. But sci-fi, I would say Europe is, they will eat up sci-fi. And you look at something like Dune this weekend, it's going to be massive the world over, particularly in Asia. Asia will love huge, high-octane, big action movies, and anything sci-fi, it's a kind of guaranteed success. And then the other question was, would you say there's the most profitable genre? Live action movies. So if you think of something like the Mission Impossible, James Bond movies, the Fast and Furious, and I will say franchises, and I know that people probably are rolling their eyes because there is franchise fatigue in the market, but over the years, audiences are familiar with the characters. They've enjoyed the characters. Think of the superhero genre. It's been incredibly profitable and has brought a lot of joy to a lot of audiences. Yes, it's going through a little bit of a bumpy road at the moment, but I think that will continue to be the case. There's still a lot of stories out there. I think it's up to the studios to make sure that they're telling those stories in a way that audiences do not think it's repetitive or routine, and that they're seeing something new and exciting. So live action is certainly one, and franchises. But the other one that's very, very successful is your family animation. So think of something like Despicable Me, which has got its 4th installment releasing in July this year. Films like that, films like the Minions, and our own Sonic the Hedgehog, which is releasing at Christmas time. Family movies continue to draw audiences, and they're successful. But the other one that I'll mention, which you wouldn't expect, is Paw Patrol. And Paw Patrol has been a wonderful journey for us at Paramount to see the success of these little puppies. But the wonderful thing is the fact that the children see this movie over and over and over again. It's a parent punisher. And then they go, when it's available on the platform, on the streamer, parents are downloading the movie so children can watch it. And then the statistics for the number of times that children are rewatching these movies is phenomenal. So I think there's no one genre that's profitable, but those are the 2 or 3 that I would call out.